This is Charlie Rose.
We're at Harvard Business School for a conversation with Michael Porter. He is a university professor, which is the most distinguished position you can have as an academic at this institution, a teaching academic. He has written more than 16 books, 17 will be coming out soon. He has advised nations and corporations and institutions. He has ideas about competition and strategy, ideas about the inner city. He has advised this country about competition and productivity and many other issues. He teaches a must-do course here at the Harvard Business School about competition and strategy. This conversation is the beginning of a series we'll do here at the Harvard Business School with the students, talking about not management per se, not leadership per se, but the role of institutions in America and the kinds of leadership that is demanded, the kinds of issues that will affect their leadership. It is appropriate we begin with Michael Porter. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie.
Right.
My pleasure.
A quick background about you. Ann Arbor, Princeton, all-American tennis player. Golfer, all-American golfer. Harvard Business School. You came here to teach, or you decided in the 80s to teach. How did you get to competition as your subject?
Well, you know, it's almost embarrassing, but there was no strategy. There was a series of kind of good incremental decisions. In that particular case, you know, my defining characteristic growing up was as an athlete. I was a football player, a baseball player, a basketball player. Golf was my hobby. I took that up in college and competed at the college level in golf. So competition was my thing. And when I got to Harvard Business School as a student, which was a very last-minute decision itself, I was going to be an engineer. Then at the last minute, I decided to come here. Of course, this started exposing me to business competition. And then I had the various curious situation of 1 year studying here at the Harvard Business School and the next year going across the river, as we say, to the other part of the university and studying industrial economics. And it was really the juxtaposition of those two subjects that really ignited my interest in this field of competition. And it's really been my path ever since.
A notion about competitors. Do they share, those who practice the art of competition at its highest levels, share qualities, the individuals who lead nations, companies, institutions?
I think they share certain qualities, although there's tremendous variation. I mean, I think the most important quality of good competitive leaders is that they have a direction, they have a vision, they have a longer-term perspective of where they want to be, they have a sense for how they're different, how they want to be different, how they want to extend those differences over time. They're not just trying to be better at what everybody else is doing. They really have a passion for being different, and that is to me the single defining characteristic.
And a will to win? I mean, is there something about...
Of course a will to win.
A psychological...
Yeah, but the will to win is not enough. You can try really, really hard.
If you have no talent.
But if you don't have a direction, you're not going to be successful.
And talent.
And talent.
Yeah. What did you find out when you looked at competition, beyond the qualities of an individual, that was necessary for all of us to understand, whether we're an individual, corporation, nation?
Well, yeah, I think that...
What's the subject of all these books is sort of the question.
Well, it's a little bit of a hard question, Charlie, to answer in very, very concisely. But basically, I found that we needed a structure to think about what were the underlying characteristics of competition. That was what was really missing. You know, there's endless management books about improving quality and enhancing your supply chain and defining your IT approach. And you know, management is very fad-oriented. Managers, there's a flavor of the minute. It's merging or it's outsourcing or whatever. But what was really lacking in the field and really continues to be a great challenge is really an underlying framework for what are the true underlying principles, the true underlying economics of competition. So, and I think that there's two or three of those that I would highlight here. I think number one, to compete successfully, you've got to have the appropriate goal. This is one of the biggest problems in America today. The businesses have the wrong goal. They're trying to maximize shareholder value. But that's actually the wrong goal. That, if you measure shareholder value by the stock price, that says that you're trying to please shareholders. If you start out with a goal of trying to please shareholders, you will destroy your company. It's 100% certain in my experience. The right goal for any business is to achieve a superior return on investment. And so you've got to start with the right goal. You've got to start fundamentally with the principle that any true competitive success requires uniqueness. It requires you to be different. It requires you to create some different form of value than your competitors do. Yet so many companies today just mindlessly imitate their competitors. They try to replicate best practices. They follow the latest trend. And so, I mean, again, we could go on, but those two simple insights I think are extraordinarily important in separating successful enterprises or nonprofits or governments even from others.
When you began to advise nations, is it different for a nation that wants to be competitive in a global economy than it is for a corporation in terms of the principle? Have a goal. Secondly, make sure that you don't make the wrong assumption about what it is you ought to be achieving.
Yeah. Well, at that level, yes, it's basically the same, although the goal for a nation is different than the goal for a company. The goal for a nation is, of course, the ultimate aim is to raise the standard of living. To raise the standard of living, we know that you have to raise productivity. You have to be able to produce more output per day of work, more output per dollar of capital invested. That's the only way you can pay yourself more. You can be richer. In order to be more productive, now is where the differences arise. From a business point of view, you want to get a competitive advantage. You want to create a distinctive value proposition versus your rivals. For a nation, you're really competing by creating the right platform or business environment that enables companies to be more and more and more and more productive. So from a national strategy point of view, their focus is really on creating the right rules, creating the right business environment, creating the right enabling conditions. It's interesting that when I started working on strategy, I never thought about government. I never thought about nations. I never thought about location at all. I was just focusing on what products, what markets, what customers, what value chain configuration. But the more I studied and was exposed to competition, I started seeing that, yes, the company has a lot of influence over its success. It has a lot of scope to position itself, but actually the company depends a lot on that business environment. If the company can't hire the right people, it can't have a certain strategy. If the company can't get access to the right technology, it's not going to be very innovative. Right. So over time, what I found was there's this inextricable connection between company success and national or regional success.
I've had CEOs like Jeff Immelt say to me on this program, you want to know how I'm going to perform, tell me what the economic environment is that I'm going to be operating within before I can tell you what our growth will be from year to year to year.
And there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah. There's also when you talk about competition, there's not one thing. I mean, it is a combination of things that you have to pay attention to.
Right.
What are they?
Well, basically, I would argue that the essence of strategy falls into kind of a number of very important principles that can then each be in turn developed into more complexity. Number one is the one I've already mentioned. You got to start with the right goal. Right. If all you're trying to do is grow the business, as I like to tell my corporate friends, that's easy. You can grow the business by making a stupid acquisition. You can grow the business by cutting your price in half. Yeah. You can even grow your business even faster by giving your product away. I mean, the internet companies took that, to ad absurdum. They said, gee, everybody loves our product, but it was free. Of course they love your product. So you got to start with the right goal. Then you've got to develop a unique value proposition. You've got to be offering a different value than your competitors are offering in terms of the product, in terms of the service, in terms of the price-value combination. That's number two. Number three, you've got to find a way to configure your company, what I call the value chain. You've got to try to configure that value chain in a distinctive way that allows you to actually deliver some unique value. So if you're producing the same way, marketing the same way, delivering the same way, you're not going to be unique. You've got to kind of design your own tailored value chain. So those are some of the key principles. It gets very complex when you start to ask yourself, okay, how do I combine all these elements in a distinctive way for my company?
All right. The notion of strategy.
Yep.
I mean, in the beginning, in the 80s, when you were teaching here, it was
Right.
about competition.
Right.
And the first books were about competition.
Right.
And a competitive environment and how to
Right.
win in that.
Right.
Did you wake up one day and say, there's something missing here? Or did somebody come and say to you, strategy?
Well, you're right. My initial focus was on the competitive environment, and that's what gave rise to this so-called five forces way of looking at industries. And the reason for that was that my roots were, my formal training was industrial economics, and industrial economics was focused on industries.
Right.
So that was the shortest leap. But I remember to this day, I was sitting in an empty house on the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee, finishing up the book Competitive Strategy.
Right.
And it was all about the competitive environment. It was all about industry analysis and emerging industries and declining industries. And I said, I need to say something about how the firm competes within its industry.
Right.
So I wrote this chapter for that book called Chapter 2 on generic strategies. And it said, to think about positioning or competing within the industry, you've got to decide whether you want to be low cost or differentiated or focused. And I introduced that notion of how to think about alternative strategic positionings. And that was really a very, very primitive, low-tech way of thinking about strategy. So we published that book. I think most of the focus of the book was really on the competitive environment stuff, but there was a lot of debate about low-cost differentiation and focus. And in fact, I was getting attacked. Can't you be low-cost and differentiated at the same time? Is this really valid? And so I really went on this quest to try to deepen my understanding of strategy. Out of that came the Competitive Advantage book. Out of that came an article called What is Strategy some years ago. Out of that is coming the latest book. So I really started focusing on strategy very early, but it was very primitive in retrospect.
Is democracy good for competition, global competition, if you are a competitor?
I think that this has been a raging debate among scholars because of there's cases like Singapore
exactly.
where it's argued
Lee
that
Kuan Yew believed mostly in
kind of ran the show and that was undemocratic and therefore it was successful.
But successul.
But quite successful.
And on the other hand, you will hear a lot about in the Middle East. I mean, the two of the things that have limited some Muslim communities and countries from doing more. One is the role of women. Mm-hmm. And two is the absence of democracy.
I would agree with that. So my view is ultimately, if you have in the earlier stages of economic development, if you have a Lee Kuan Yew, if you have somebody that's completely uncorrupt, that's completely data-driven, that makes good choices, that can speed things up. That can enhance your development. But the risks are enormous, as we see in the Middle East, that if you have people that are not so skilled, that are not so data-driven, that are more... And another problem in the Middle East, I find, is lack of transparency. There's no information. Nobody discloses anything. You can't find out... you go to a Middle Eastern country and try to find out how somebody is doing, and you can't find out. So there's no transparency. There's an unwillingness to expose decisions and choices to debate and scrutiny, which is really a sort of a first cousin to lack of democracy. So I think the risks of not having democracy are probably greater on average, overwhelmingly greater than the benefits in those one or two cases of not having democracy.
Okay. You do have something called the Global Competitive Report.
Yes, sir.
Is that the title of it?
Global Competitiveness Report.
Competitiveness Report.
You asked me about the title.
I did. You weren't just correcting me. I asked you about the title.
Right.
All right. So here, and you compare. There's a measurement. There is a measuring stick.
Right.
For determining global competitiveness.
Of a particular country, yes.
A country.
And we looked this year at 101 different countries. And we rank them on the basis of their underlying competitiveness.
And who's number one?
This year it was Finland.
And how did they get there?
Well, they got there through actually a very interesting 20 or 25-year process, which is probably beyond the scope of this discussion.
It sure is.
But
and I think that they may have more cell phones per capita than any other country, too.
Yeah, and that's actually a critical part of the story.
Okay.
But Finland got there because they built a highly productive, highly innovative economy through a whole series of policy choices made over a long period of time. And what we try to do in this Global Competitiveness Report is we try to look at those many dimensions that really make up competitiveness. One of the things that we've learned about competitiveness is that everything matters for competitiveness. The schools matter, the roads matter, the cell phones matter, the incentive structure matters, the stability of the political process matters. So what we do in the Global Competitiveness Report is we look at dozens and dozens and dozens of indicators that we can then statistically link with prosperity. And our key metric of prosperity is the GDP per capita growing.
I'm trying to tee up this question.
Yes, sir.
We'll get to Japan in just a moment. I'm trying to tee up this question.
Yes, sir.
Many people I know think that this is going to be the Asian century. They look, for example, at what's happening in the marketplace for cars. China now is dramatically increased as a market for Japanese cars. It's now second to the United States. China is doing so many other things because of the number of people as a market. Most people believe the Chinese economy, as it grows, may be the most largest economy in 50 years, some say even earlier. There's also the Indian economy, a different political structure. On the kinds of things that you look at, who would you bet on, India or China?
Oh my gosh, that's a very hard question because they both have significant strengths. I guess right now I would say that China is doing better in the first couple laps.
Right. Most people believe China will do better early,
right,
and that India will kick in 10, right, 15 years.
Yeah. I think the problem with India is that it's still a society where there's an enormous amount of intrusive and inappropriate regulatory and government involvement in the economy, which has been very, very slow to withdraw. Also, in India, we have to remember that those well-educated people that are doing the IT outsourcing
right,
represent a microscopic fraction of the overall society. And in fact, the whole formal economy in India is a very, very small part of the total population. So I think India has the great advantages of English-speaking people in many cases, a long history of working in the West. There are any number of Indian entrepreneurs that have built companies here in the U.S. that go back to India, and people go back and forth. I think in terms of entrepreneurship, in building world-class companies, I think India has great strengths. But it's like they have a giant cement shoe on each leg because of all this regulatory stuff. Yeah. And
but China has the same kind of limitation, it would assume, in terms of, in some examples, a kind of censorship and a kind of command political structure.
Yes, but China's been welcoming foreign investment.
I know.
China's been aggressively assimilating foreign technology. In India, for the longest time, they just said, "Oh, we're not going to protect intellectual property at all. We won't even pay lip service to it."
Here's the interesting question: is this simply because Deng Xiaoping was so wise beyond his years, as old as he was, and he, from the Long March to the Cultural Revolution to China in a modern age, understood some basic things about his country and its potential and its future? One man, and was able, therefore, to influence a whole intellectual community.
It seems that way. I mean, this is not...
It's a remarkable story of leadership.
It's a remarkable story. I think, however, he had a very, very vivid case study of what happened in the world economy in the post-World War II period. He really saw the failure of the socialist market system. Right. And I think, unlike many, was able to confront that. I mean, you have Castro still saying, "Oh, it's the greatest, it's the greatest, it's the greatest." People get poorer and poorer. Buildings fall down in front of your very eyes. "Oh, this is the greatest system."
But everybody that goes down there, I mean, I just had Oliver Stone on the program, and a filmmaker, who made JFK, by the way, and Nixon, went down there. I mean, and he said, he comes back and he tells me how wonderful Castro is. Most Westerners I go get they get seduced by Castro because he tells them about schools and nutrition and health care, saying it's all better. Yet the economy
is in
pathetic.
shambles, and people are living a barely subsistence. And it once was a very wealthy society. But see, I think that there are many like Castro who continue to cling to the dream that this socialist system is a fairer system. But the wonderful thing about China is they've been able to reconcile the political ideology with ultimately betting on a capitalist economy. And imagine the leadership and the political savvy that was necessary to pull that off.
Yeah.
What a Now, there are many who argue that that's an inherently unstable situation. I also believe that China is now on its way to a bit of the Japan problem when Japan was so successful. And that is that China is a very good seller, but it's not a very good buyer.
Meaning it has unfair trade practices.
Unfair trade practices. It has a lack of intellectual property protection, which is a deep problem because, see, that's the kind of stuff that countries like the U.S. should be selling. Stuff that's, movies and software and products
And that's
like
stuff
that.
they don't want.
And that's stuff
Or they want to put a barrier to it.
They either put a barrier to it or do not protect the intellectual property so it gets ripped off.
Right.
So we have this massive trade imbalance with China. Like we had a massive trade imbalance
$45 billion or something like
with
that.
Japan.
Right.
And that just creates political forces which do nothing but mischief. And we're in the middle of that now with this election cycle. It's just going to get more and more.
We'll speak to that for a second.
Sure.
Outsourcing. Companies say the following. I've been reading Michael Porter, and he says, I got to be competitive, and I got to find the most efficient way to produce my product. The most efficient way to produce my product is outsource it to India. And all of a sudden, the political environment's turned against me, and people are saying, how dare you do that? That's terrible, because there are people who are suffering in America the throes of economic insecurity.
Yeah.
They're worried about their economic security, they're worried about their health care, and they're worried about their future because they see this world they believed in.
Yeah. Well, I think this
Destabilized.
is a very, again, one of those issues that is easy to talk about in a political sense, but gets more complicated when you think about it. First, I think the first point is that outsourcing has been going on for the last 100 years, round numbers. And it's really the natural evolution of the economic system, and it's how you raise productivity. You stop doing things that you're not productive at,
Right.
and you refocus your energy on the things that you're good at.
And you retrain the people that have been doing that to do something else.
Right. Now,
But that costs money too.
that costs money too. But I think that the second point that I think is well understood is that the actual number of jobs that are affected by the outsourcing that is talked about in the media today, the IT, the accounting, the advertising, is minuscule. I mean, it's almost unmeasurable in terms of the overall U.S. economy. It's hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's not millions of jobs. And a third point is that there's a natural tendency in an economic downturn to go for the short-term cost savings. So when the engineer costs $10,000 here and $100,000 here, it seems obvious that you want to go buy more of the $10,000.
Right.
But then what happens over time is you start to see more of the hidden costs of that. And it turns out that yes, you can have that engineer in India, but there's all these issues that have to do with how you communicate with that engineer, how that engineer gets integrated, how the products that engineer develops really fit with the other things the company is doing. And it turns out to be more complicated. And I think a lot of companies have been so pressured to drive down cost that they've been kind of looking past those issues. I suspect we're going to have a backlash back in the other direction. I think we're going to find companies that outsource things. They're going to say, wait a minute, that wasn't very efficient. And they're going to bring things
Well,
back.
but what do you think about, as a practical matter or as a philosophical matter, what's John Kerry's recommending in terms of changing the tax structure and not allowing companies who make money overseas to defer paying taxes until the time that they bring the money back home? Or is that too new an issue?
My basic view is that a minor part of the calculation that affects outsourcing.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to affect much corporate behavior.
Tax engineering will not change.
I don't think it's going to make much
because it's not that big of an item.
It's not that big of an item.
two. Is corporate governance, in your judgment, good for competition, independent boards of directors, closer scrutiny of audit committees and compensation committees?
Yes, although I think we've already gone far enough. I think we've turned.
Sarbanes-Oxley is far enough, if not too far?
Yeah, I think we've kind of turned the boardroom now into this enormous legal ritual. And so, and I am not viewed as qualified to be a member of an audit committee under the rules, okay? Because I've never been a CFO.
Oh, I see.
Because I don't have, I'm not a certified public accountant. So that's how far we've gone.
Would you want to be part of an audit committee?
Not anymore. Not anymore. So I think that there's been a long history in America of thinking that if you just manipulated the board somehow, that all the company's decisions would be right. I think actually there's probably much. I think a lot of these reforms were probably a good thing, but at the root of most of the problems was really not so much failures of corporate governance, but I think it's really an unhealthy interaction between the financial markets and the corporate markets, and I think it was poor incentive structures that put too much weight on stock price. I think pretty much all of the evils will derive from that issue.
I don't know what this book was published when.
I think in 1999.
99, so 5 years ago.
Yeah, Japan was in the pits when that book was published.
In the 90s, it was in the pits.
Right.
It seems to be in recovery.
It is a recovery.
What did it get wrong, and what is it getting right? We all know that the banks of Japan were lending money and issuing bad debt after bad debt after bad debt. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows that idea.
Right.
We all know that they had, a political culture that needed help.
Completely unresponsive to
unresponsive
citizens.
to citizens.
Citizens didn't matter.
Yeah. But it wasn't that long ago, in the 70s, we all looked at the Japanese model, and we read Peter Drucker and everybody else saying, I've seen the future, and it's Tokyo.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, this book was a fun book to work on because even the very title is kind of mind-boggling. Yeah, right. Can Japan compete? Because this school was a hotbed of courses and cases about Japan, and I think that certainly my thinking about Japan it goes something like this: that really the problem really starts by the fact that I think we in the West and even many Japanese misunderstood why Japan was successful in the first place. The kind of notion was that there was this Japanese model that involved, meaty government steering of the economy.
Yeah. The relation between the government and business.
Targeting industries and so forth. What we found from looking at the actual evidence over the post-war period was that those industries where that model was applied were failures. Okay, this is stunning. We're failures. That model was applied in software, in financial services, in aerospace, in chemicals. They were all failures. The industries.
Why were they failures? Simply because?
Because government intervened, stunted competition, distorted the market. Whereas the industries that Japan succeeded in, automobiles, electronics, robots, et cetera, were industries where the Japanese government didn't play, where they left it alone. In fact, some of them, they tried to play, but the industry said, nope, sorry, not interested. Like autos is a famous case.
But the idea also was then, and still somewhat, that because two things happened. One, we're coming out of World War II, and in the beginning, the idea was we have to protect our industries and our companies because we're coming from ground zero.
Right.
We've got to build up. We've got to protect them, number one.
Yep.
And number two, on the other side it was pacifism in the Constitution. So they didn't have to worry about a defense budget.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm certain the defense budget certainly allowed, lack of defense budget actually allowed a higher rate of national investment, and that was good, and that's part of the story. But
and savings was way higher.
See, but fundamentally, what you see in Japan is wherever they actually, they did protect, they did have high tariffs, and then initially there was a lot of non-trade barriers. But what Japan had that was so precious was that they had tremendously vigorous internal competition. So there were like 25 camera companies, and there were 11 auto companies, and there was kind of vicious internal competition. So it wasn't such a bad problem if you had a lot of inside competition among Japanese companies, and you protected it from international competition. They could still do okay. What happened was that those industries where government really intervened in internal competition and protected it from international competition, they failed. So what happens in Japan is they made another really fundamental mistake. They assumed that all they had to worry about were the export industries, and this was this export-led growth. Right. What happened was they essentially sheltered, protected, and made extremely inefficient all the local industries: wholesaling, retailing, healthcare, and what that did was it drove up the cost of doing business dramatically in Japan. So these very successful global companies that they created no longer wanted to invest in Japan anymore. You know, the Canons of this world were building plants in Taiwan and Korea. They didn't want to operate in Japan because it was too inefficient a place to do business. So they had their successful companies not reinvesting. Their unsuccessful protected companies were failing. And Japan, the structure in Japan really has really blocked the formation of a lot of new industries. There's no new Japanese industry that any of you can think of, anybody in this room. It used to be that they went from steel to cars to VCRs, but then it just stopped.
And became a leader in each of those.
Right. That regeneration process stopped. So with a combination...
Why did it stop again?
It stopped because Japan is really not very good at spawning new enterprising companies. The incentive structure works against it. The risk-taking works against it. There's no venture capital. The banks don't play at all in small companies. And so the kind of regeneration process really stopped.
But it's back. So what did they do? Did they simply wake up one day and say, as the American automobile companies did when they faced the Japanese competition, wake up one day and say, wait a minute, you know, we got to change. I mean, we've got a zero interest rate.
Right.
We got companies that are bankrupt.
Right.
We got tons of bad debt.
Right.
And we're falling behind, even though we're 75% of the Asian economy. And our economy is bigger than all the other economies of Asia put together.
Right. Well, I think first of all, we have to remember that Japan always had, even during the worst of the 90s, a cadre of world-class companies.
Right.
And the question was kind of, were those world-class companies going to re-up in Japan, or were they going to continue just to spread their activities around the world? I think what happened in Japan was, first of all, government finally got serious about addressing some of the problems of bad debt and the banking crisis. I'll remember to this day sitting with Takanaka-san, the kind of czar, the finance czar. The poor guy was like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He was just completely dead. I mean, he was just kind of hanging off his chair, and we're kind of colleagues, and so we were kind of talking as friends. And he just recounted the story after story of attack after attack after attack after attack about how he was personally, vilified for suggesting that banks should have to write off their bad loans and so on. The political process was so dysfunctional that it took Japan like 12 years to do something the United States did almost overnight. Remember when we had the S&L crisis?
Right.
Remember what happened? We said, oh my God, this is a disaster. We formed the Resolution Trust Corporation. Boom, everybody wrote it off and moved on. In Japan, they can't write things off and move on. They have to debate and discuss and discuss. So that was part of it. Now there really are no trade barriers anymore.
None.
Japan is now really welcoming foreign investment.
Yeah, sure.
Japan now has a real antitrust policy. And is now there's now a consensus in Japan that competition is good.
Yeah, was there any psychological damage in terms of self-esteem when all of a sudden this was a country, the same kind of psychological damage, and I mean this in the broadest sense of if you can measure a national psyche, that Russia, between the Soviet Union and Russia, I heard Putin the other day bemoaning the notion, saying it was painful to think about, Russia no longer being the power it had under the Soviet Union. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean he wants to go back, but he was certainly painful about...
Yeah. Well, I think Japan's psyche has taken a hit, but it really had to, because I think Japan's image of itself needed to get aligned with reality. And I think that's happened. And I think Japan is I think on the way up. Japan has enormous strengths. It has an enormous technological capacity. Next to the United States, it really has the greatest technological capacity.
Not only that, it's got a big market that's sitting next to China,
it's got proximity to China, a history of dealing with China.
And will there be a political problem between Japan and China for dominance for?
Oh, I'm sure there will. I'm sure this is going to be a complex political problem for decades to come.
Let me move quickly to two issues before I turn it over to this audience and give them a chance to talk to you. One is, what interests me a lot, is the inner city. You want to figure out how capital can come into the inner, correct me, can come into the inner city in an effective way and produce quality of life, jobs,
right,
education.
That's. Let me
Very simple.
Let me build up on that a little bit. Basically, I think I got about a decade ago, almost to this day, I got very, very concerned. I was working on competitiveness and economic development. I had worked in Massachusetts. I had started to work in Connecticut. I'd worked in other parts of the world. We knew quite a bit about what it takes to build a competitive Massachusetts or what it takes to build a competitive a country, but within the United States, we had this concentrated poverty in our cities. And we were viewing concentrated poverty in our cities as a social problem. We were thinking that fundamentally that's a social problem. It's about education, housing, drugs, childcare, and things like that. And the perception was that the way to solve the problem of concentrated poverty in our urban areas was basically social programs. We have to do more of this. We have to provide more of this. We came to the realization that that was maybe an important dimension of how to revitalize our urban communities, but was ultimately not going to be successful unless we also added an economic component. Because without a healthy economy, without a vibrant economy, without a job base, we were going to continue to have to pump social dollars.
Yeah, but have a politician, I mean, way back to Robert Kennedy
right.
and Bedford Stuyvesant,
right.
Ideas for what to do about the inner city. Jack Kemp was always interested in what to do about the South Bronx.
Exactly.
Why have all those efforts failed?
They fail fundamentally.
And what's different about what you want to do?
Well, what's different is that we sort of turned the question on its head. We said, look, we've got to create a viable economic base in our urban cores.
But is that a new idea or?
Well, that's not a new idea.
Okay.
What's the really, really new idea was that if you're going to create a vibrant economic base, you've got to look for the competitive advantages rather than focus on reducing the competitive disadvantages.
Right.
See, the perception of inner cities in the United States was of this massive economic wasteland. Nobody able to work, massive, economic, disadvantages of every sort.
Right. Education, crime, everything.
Oh, everything. Okay. People were frozen by that. I mean, literally paralyzed, hopeless. What can we do? What we said was, okay, let's think about it from the other point of view. What potential advantages might we find? And so, for example, we discovered, with the help of the Boston Consulting Group, who did the analytical work, we actually discovered that inner cities have a gigantic market. That the people on average have low incomes, but they're very densely living in a dense living circumstance. The purchasing power then per square mile was actually very high, and all the retailers had abandoned the inner city. So if you're going to try to revitalize the inner city, let's get retail investment flowing because there's a really great market there. And the retailers at this point had saturated the suburban market.
Right.
And they were going to Mexico, taking currency risk, trying to operate in Mexico. But we actually, BCG calculated that there was a $100 billion consumer market actually in the inner city that was underserved. So that's the kind of thinking. What economic advantages?
A market underserved ought to be music to any entrepreneur's idea.
Absolutely. So now Walgreens, every major retailer now has an inner city investment strategy. Okay, that's just one. We made the obvious realization that inner cities in America were actually very valuable economic locations because they were central, because they were sitting along the transportation infrastructure. So in businesses that were logistically intensive, inner city ought to be a good location. So let's try to build businesses in the inner city with that insight. Rather than try to subsidize and have empowerment zones and all this kind of stuff, Let's build a strategy around leveraging the strengths and the advantages. And that insight led to the formation of a nonprofit in 1994, the Initiative for Competitive Intercity, that now works across this country.
I'm going to get to this audience, but I got 3 quick questions. Number one is that the next book is about what? It's going to be out soon.
The next book is Strategy 3.
All right. More strategy.
Competitive strategy, competitive advantage. It's really been, going on 20 years.
Yeah.
Since I have published an entire book on strategy, and that's because I got interested in all this other stuff.
Right.
But I think now we're ready for what I would see in my own way as the 3rd generation of thinking about strategy. And
Second question. Do you worry about the United States and its competitive position in the world?
I do. I think we have enormous strengths in the United States, but we have one category of really glaring weaknesses, and that's in human resources, ironically. We're sitting among some of the greatest human resources in the world here. And I would hasten to add that they're not the problem.
Yes.
The problem is in the people that don't end up at the Harvard Business School. It's the public education system.
Public education. Well, public education in terms of 1 to 12. Huh?
K through 12. The average level of education for the average American is no longer good enough to really sustain and support the high wages that we have.
It is amazing to me. I mean, that we haven't done better by that.
Right.
I mean, a lot of, if you look at every big city and they're trying to do something about it, and they're bringing in people who are not by definition educators, whether it's Joel Klein in New York or whether Romer out in L.A. or a general in Cleveland or Chicago or,
Well, I'm a little more optimistic in the sense that the United States is on this case. It's a hard one, and it's going to take a long time. But it's K through 12, and then the other thing that I would mention is that last I checked, the number of engineers graduating from American universities is actually down.
Oh, sure. Bill Gates was up at MIT and here and talked to me about it.
Right.
And he's enormously concerned because he thinks that the technology, America's leading technology, has driven the economy and has driven America's position in the world.
And our high standard of living. And so if we don't have enough scientific and technical talent, it's going to be very hard to sustain that. So I think almost all the other aspects that we really care about in thinking about competitiveness are really pretty good, but that is the real scary thing about the future of this country.
Now, you have adopted a lifestyle that's comfortable for you. You write books, you teach here, and of course that everybody has to take. You are recognized as the leading academic advisor, thinker, consultant to companies around the world and nations. Do you think you could run an institution? Is all this knowledge you have, could you take it?
Well, I'm pretty confident about running a business institution. I'm extremely close to running business institutions. I've been deeply involved in starting a bunch of companies. I've worked very, very closely with CEOs of major companies. I'm pretty confident. But frankly, I think I get the best of that world already. I get to work with companies at the most interesting moments, on the most interesting problems. So why would I want to go and slog away and go to those audit committee meetings?
Exactly.
The more interesting question for me has always been, do I want to go into government?
Right.
And there, frankly, I'm extremely scared of the political process and how decisions actually get made and whether I'd be actually very good at that. I mean, I'm used to trying to figure out what's the right answer. And a system where the answer is always a compromise, it just seems to me to be a little bit
that's the difference between government and business.
So,
right there. Let me take some questions
yes,
here.
sir.
All right, somebody having listened to this conversation here.
Good evening. My name is Catherine Rowley, first-year MBA student. My question is about the initiative for the competitive inner city. I've read a lot about your work there. I'm interested if you could elaborate a little bit more on how you have taken the competitive strategies and business frameworks and how you have applied them to the inner city approach, and also how you would alter or change your approach to philanthropy and or non-for-profit organizations.
Well, there's really two questions there. Very, very briefly, on the Inner City Initiative, The first objective of the Intercity Initiative, which is a nonprofit corporation which I founded in 1994 that now works across the country, the first objective was to change the way leaders thought about how to revitalize inner cities. Because again, as I said, the prevailing approach was a social model. We wanted to kind of shift that to more of an economic model based on competitive advantages and leveraging strengths. The second challenge was to create a set of programs that would catalyze change in cities across America. And again, I don't have time to cover all of those, but for example, we created a program called the Inner City 100. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that, but every year Inc. magazine publishes in its May issue the 100 fastest growing private companies based in economically distressed inner city areas. And it goes through a national search. This year they received around 7,500 nominations to be on this list. The PricewaterhouseCoopers vets the companies to make sure the growth rates are appropriate. We picked the top 100. Why do we do that? Well, because one of the biggest problems holding back inner cities as investment locations is the perception that they can't be competitive.
Right.
So if we figured that if we could find 100, high growth, exciting companies already in inner cities and publicize those nationally and make sure that the mayor in the city knew about them and make sure that the business leaders in the city knew about them, that would have a profound effect on perceptions. And so that's an example of how the Inner City Initiative tries to highlight and reinforce and support this sort of market-based approach. On philanthropy, I would have predicted, 20 years ago, the last thing I'd ever write an article on would be philanthropy. But I've actually written 2, and I'm on a 3rd now, because I've increasingly come to see that economic and social cannot be separated. That we can't neatly put the economic things and the corporate things in one box and the social, societal things in another box. That they're inextricably intertwined. Education is an economic and a social issue. Safety is an economic and a social issue. Environmental impact is an economic and a social issue. I've also come to see that philanthropy is fundamental to addressing many of the social agendas this country faces, because the limits of government and the limited budgets of government are all too apparent. So what I've tried to do is bring sort of competitive thinking to the philanthropic sector.
Yes.
I'm Jack Guerrero, a second-year student in the program. Professor, in your dialogue with Mr. Rose, you've been very critical of a corporate focus on share price or pursuit of shareholder value.
Right.
Do you mean to suggest that there are other noble objectives pursuing in the interest of a variety of other constituencies, i.e. Community, workers, et cetera, which might in fact not be consistent with creating shareholder value?
Or maximizing profit?
Yeah. I don't, that's not the critique. In fact, I think it's extremely risky to think about sort of the stakeholder notion. I think my view is that the best way to help employees and the other stakeholders is actually to be economically successful. And without true economic success, the kind of sustainability of a company is at risk. The distinction I would make is between the share price as a measure of the value of the company and really the true rate of return or invested capital that the company is actually able to generate on a sustained basis. I believe that the only appropriate goal is actually to create, an attractive, sustained, high return on investment. That's the goal that one should be managing the company towards. I believe that the share price is only momentarily and rarely aligned with that. That share prices go up and down based on all kinds of reasons. I also think there's a fundamental disconnect between investors and companies. The average share of stock in America is held for less than 1 year. The investor is only going to be there for a while. The investor only cares about what's going to happen to that company during the next 8 months or 12 months during which they're going to hold the stock. There's a misalignment between the investor's goals and the company's fundamental goals, in my opinion. And this is something that I think hopefully the finance theorists of this world will eventually come up and kind of reflect and think about it in their work. The behavioral finance is starting to kind of nibble at this. It used to be an act of heresy to say what I just said, that what's good for General Motors isn't good for Wall Street. the idea that there wouldn't be this alignment between investors and companies would be unthinkable. But I think now we're understanding very clearly in this modern era where there's such rapid trading that there is this misalignment. Therefore, any CEO that tries to figure out what the investor wants today and deliver that is almost inevitably going to make serious errors that undermine the true profit earning potential of the business. And so my advice to CEOs is, figure out what it takes to have a competitive advantage, figure out what it takes to sustain that competitive advantage, earn that high and sustained return, grow the business as fast as you can while maintaining that competitive advantage, but no faster. And then the share price ultimately is going to take care of itself. The share price is the result; it's not the goal. It's the outcome. It's not the cause. So, but this thinking is still somewhat controversial. One other point I would make is probably the single best public policy decision that's been made in the post-war period for purposes of helping improve strategy is the dividend tax change. Because now, for the first time in many, many, many years, companies have a choice. They can choose not to try to do the Hail Mary and grow twice as fast as their market in order to boost their share price. They can just make money and by having a clear strategy and then pay that profitability back to the shareholders in the form of dividends. I think that simple change is going to have a profound impact, I think, on management choice. It's going to take a while. It's already starting to happen. But see, we got ourselves stuck into a situation where the only way you could get rewarded was to grow the stock price rapidly. And that was not only your reward in terms of the shareholder, but also the reward in terms of the manager, because all the incentives were tied to that stock price. And in fact, I'm on boards of companies where people didn't even care about their bonus anymore. The bonus was chump change. It was irrelevant. They only cared about the share price. And we create a situation where I think managers got too attentive to the share price, too attentive to the investor, and started doing all kinds of bad things, some of which were outright fraud and illegal, most of which were just bad strategy choices, getting into bad segments of the market, making stupid acquisitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really, I think, one of the most fundamental issues in management right now is what's the right goal, what's the role of the shareholder, I see the first rays of optimism that I felt now in probably 10 years in this area.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you at the Harvard Business School. Thank you for joining us for this conversation, the first in a series at the Harvard Business School, talking about important issues having to do with management, leadership, competition, strategy, human resources, and the role of America and American business in the world, globalization, all of that for consideration as we continue this series of conversations. Again, our thanks to Michael Porter. See you next time.